I have already opened up farm.html and I have opened it in the browser as well so that we can look at the changes as we make them. And we are going to be using the traditional box model to format this. And for the CSS that we are currently using for the header, which is located right here, you will notice that there is a border, 10 pixel solid black border around it. There is 2% padding between the text and the border itself. And that is pretty much all the boarding we have on header. For the text that is displaying, that has a heading 1 element. And so we have changed the font. And impact is the font that it's displaying, and because those letters are normally close together, we did add some letter spacing of 10 pixels, and I am using a relative size measurement of 3 EM for the size of the text. For the heading 3s, which are all of the headings that go with the graphics, the color is white, and white on white does not display. So that is why I put a text shadow around it so we can actually see the text. I've changed the font and I've used a relative measurement for the size of 200%. And for the image, I used 100% because 100% is mobile friendly. And that allows the image to shrink and grow with the size of the screen. It works really well. Then if we look down in the HTML, you can see that we have article, and inside article we have section. With section, we have an ID of parent box. And then inside section, we have several divisions, and all of the divisions have a class of child. Typically, IDs are only applied to one element, and classes are applied to more than one. So we have a parent and we have several children. Whatever we do to the parent is going to affect all of the children. And we are going to be styling both the parent box ID and the child class. And we are going to start with the child class. So it's .child. And we're going to set a width of 25%. And so what that means is each one of these is going to take up about 1/4 of the width of the screen. And I'm going to save this as we go so you can see what it's doing. So if I reload, you can see that each one of these is taking up about 1/4. Now let me add our next property, which is padding. So what padding does, I'm going to save this, is it puts a little space between your content and the edge of its containing box. In this case, the containing box is division. So let me reload. And you should have seen this jump just a little bit because now there is 1% space around the outside. The next thing we're going to add is a border. And the border is actually going to let you kind of see the outline of the division. Okay, so the border is going to go around this element. And it pretty much makes the element easier to see. So we're going to do border. It's going to be a 10 pixel border. We're using a style of groove and a color of white. Because we use groove, groove actually does kind of a two-tone color. I'm going to save this and reload it. Okay, so you can kind of see it's got gray and white. That's very typical of groove. So now you get a little better idea of the actual dimensions of each division. So we said it was 25%, but we've already added padding. And that padding setting goes on the top, right, bottom, and left. So we've basically added 1% to either side. So right now, the width is at 27% plus the 10 pixel border on each side. Now you're going to notice if we look how the borders are like all smashed together. So to fix this, we're going to add a margin setting. So margin goes outside the border area, kind of between our elements. So we're going to add margin of 1%. And because I'm not specifying left, right, or bottom, it's just going to put the margin around everything. And it always starts at the top, right, bottom, and left. So let me save this and reload. And now you can see we have space. And the space that we have between all of these elements is 1%. Now to make these stand out even further, what we're going to do is we're going to add one more property, and that is background. And we're going to set the background to black. So what that's going to do in each division, inside each division, it's going to color the background black, and then we'll have the text and the graphics sitting on top of that. So we're going to save this, and we're going to reload, and that looks so much better. And now you can really see the space that the division element is occupying. And you'll see if you resize, the space is going to change depending on the size of your screen. So this is our child element. And it is inside our parent box ID container. And to add a little more space around our children, we're going to apply some padding to the parent. So we're setting up a parent ID, and let's do some padding here. And we'll save it. So take a look now, and I'm going to reload this. And you should see all of the children kind of shift a little bit because we've added some more space. Now, our goal in the traditional box is to get all of our children kind of lined up next to each other. And there's several different ways you can do this, but if you are using traditional box, the technique that you would use is float. So in our child class, we would add float left. I'm going to save that. And what that's going to do, because each one of these has the child class applied, adding float left to sheep is going to allow pigs to display next to it. And then we're going to have float left on pigs, which is going to allow cows to display next to it. So I'm going to reload. Okay, and you can see that pigs is next to sheep, cows is next to pigs. And then the poor browser just gets a little bit confused. And this often happens when you use float on multiple elements. Okay, it does okay for a while, and then it's just like, oh no, this is too much for me. I'm confused. There is a workaround for this. We have to use the clear property. And I'm going to create a clear float class. Just in case we ever wanted to add more divisions with additional graphics, it is good to create a class because then you can use it more than once. And we're going to be using the clear property, and we're going to set it to both, meaning right now we have float left, but if we were to add float right, it would just clears out everything. So I'm going to save this and we'll reload. And then you're like, oh, it didn't do anything. Well, that's because I haven't applied clear float to any of my divisions yet. That is our next step. So the problem we're seeing right now is between cows and horses. What we are going to do is add a little division here. Oops, got to make sure we get it in the right place though. So it's going to be after the closing division for the cows and before the opening division for horses. And we're going to set the class equal to clear float. And we're going to save our changes. And we're going to reload. And now it should look pretty good. And we should be able to resize. And it looks pretty good for most sizes. Now, if you get super small, you may notice there's issues like that because we haven't really made this mobile friendly. By setting the image width to 100%, we've ensured it's going to look good on most screens, but there are other things that we can do to make it responsive, but we aren't going to learn those until later in the semester. So for right now, we're going to have to live with it this way, and it's pretty good for most screens. We are going to take a look at how changing the parent's width affects all of the children. Because right now, the width of the parent is basically 100%. And you might be thinking, well, I thought each one of these boxes was 25%. How come there's not 4? That is because if we take a look, using the box model, you have to add the width to the padding, to the border, and to the margins. And that'll give you your total width. So our width is 25%. So for padding, we did 1% all the way around, which means on the left and on the right, we have 1% each. So we have to add 2% to the 25%, and that gives us 27%. Then if we add the margin, which is 1% on each side, we're now at 29%. And then we have a border of 10 pixels on the left and 10 pixels on the right, which is a total of 20 pixels. So our width is 29% plus 20 pixels, which I would just round up to 30%. Okay, and that is pretty much what we're seeing. Each one of these is about 30%, and we got a little leftover space on the right. What we're going to do is adjust the width of the parent because that's going to constrain how much space the children have to operate in. If we make the parent 50%, because we have padding, the actual width of the parent is going to be 54%. And that is the space that our children are going to have to operate in. So let's save this, reload, and immediately you notice that the children are now much smaller. They have about half the area to work in that they had before or to display in. So the width of the parent affects how much space the child elements have. Okay, and any element that has other HTML elements nested inside is a parent. We are calling this ID parent so that it's very clear that that is what the section is operating as, but it doesn't matter what the ID is called. Okay, the fact is we've got all these divisions inside section. So however big section is, that is going to affect where all of these divisions can display. So the width of the parent affects the child, and so does margins. So if we get rid of width and instead set the left margin to 20% and the right margin to 20%, we are also going to be affecting the space the children elements occupy, because we're saying 20% of the screen on the left they can't use, 20% of the screen on the right they can't use, plus we've got padding which they can't use. So that's like 22% on the left, 22% on the right, those child elements cannot occupy. So I'm going to save this and we're going to reload. Okay, and you can see we've got 20% plus the 2% padding. And then over here on the right, we have 20% and the 2% padding. Okay, so that is how the parent affects the children or child. Okay, and at this point, we are going to save our changes and we are done with the traditional box. Now, make sure you keep this open because you are going to be saving this under a different name and then making modifications for the next task.